Welcome back to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where you'll find information on what's going on the North Fork of Long Island. We'll be focusing on issues and opportunities going on in the community, as well as people and stories from the present and the past. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 47, we are talking to one of the former mayors of Greenport, David Nyce. And we talked to him about his ancestry and childhood. We also discussed how he decided to move out to the West Coast early on in his life, and then how he made his way back to New York City and eventually decided to come out to Greenport, get involved in the community, and run for mayor. Additionally, we talk about what he thinks of the area today. So I hope you enjoy episode 47 with David Nyce. This episode was recorded May 6, 2024. Thank you so much for coming on to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today.
Absolutely my pleasure.
And to start off, if you could give us a little background about yourself, where you were born and raised.
Born in eastern Pennsylvania. Both my parents' families were in Lansdale, Pennsylvania. My dad's family had been in the area basically since William Penn. My mom's family were off the boat Germans, her generation before her. They both ended up in Lansdale, where my dad was part of a family business in ready-mix concrete and concrete block. So I was born there in 1962.
And how far, because you said that is that on your mom's side?
On my dad's mom's side were the Clemens. And the Clemenses came over with or around the time that William Penn was settling Philadelphia. Wow. And my dad's side of the family, the Nyces, came soon after that. They were all Mennonite. So they were all the Anabaptists that were fleeing Germany at the time of Martin Luther. So a lot of them were, certain portions of Germany ended up in Netherlands, England, Belgium as their places of exit. William Penn, having been an English subject, was transporting people. He was I don't know if William Penn himself was Mennonite or just was sympathetic to the cause.
Yeah. And in terms of your parents and your grandparents, that they all grew up in that area as well?
Yeah, my mom's grandparents and stuff were Berlin, New Jersey, and then the Philadelphia area as well. So I had a lot of relatives in southern New Jersey, Wildwood, and then Philadelphia. And most of my dad's family was in the Lansdale, Doylestown, Culpsville area. Had started off in Philadelphia, but then as people migrated up the Delaware River to in that farm country, his families had moved into that area.
And so what did your dad do for a living?
My dad went to school to be a civil engineer, and when he graduated, he went into the family business. And interestingly enough, one of the things that he learned in school was about precast wall and floor systems for construction, and talked his dad into starting to do that. They were one of the first concrete plants in the area to do precast wall and floor systems, and soon expanded the business to pick up another plant in Philadelphia, because most of the larger building obviously was in Philadelphia. So they ended up opening a second plant in Conshohocken, which is just a suburb just outside of Philadelphia.
And what about your mom?
My mom was a stay-at-home mom until my dad got fed up with business and decided he was going to go to seminary. So my mom then went to school to become a nurse, became a registered nurse, and we moved to Princeton, where my dad went to the seminary, and my mom supported a family of 4 on, see if I can remember correctly, it was just over $6 an hour as a registered nurse. It was the early 70s, so it was still possible, but it was tight. It was very tight. We were on subsidized lunches as a kid, which I used to sell for cash and stash the money so I could buy records.
But did your dad kind of say he was just fed up with the business and wanted to?
Yeah, there was a lot of stuff going on in the late 60s, particularly in construction in Philadelphia, that was, some of it somewhat shady. And, you know, my dad was and still is a very principled man. And, you know, didn't like the fact that if, you know, the state police would come in and inspect all the trucks, right? And if an inspection didn't go quite right, there was a handout. And my dad didn't cotton to that sort of thing. And and there was tension. Both his father and my mom's father had been brought into the business, and there was tension there. And I think that he decided he wanted to throw it all away and go to seminary, and not specifically to preach. I think it was more teaching was what drew him to it. But his whole family, both his father wanted to be a Mennonite minister. His grandfather had been, and I want to say his grandfather on his mother's side had been. So he came from a long line of preachers, which basically foretold that I would be an agnostic.
But how old were you when you moved to Princeton?
10.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, about 10 years old. So it was, you know, it was a formidable age, but it was young enough to be able to adapt pretty well. And it was Princeton at that time in the early 70s was a great place to grow up. I mean, the campus was wide open. It was a university town, obviously, but the campus was wide open. It wasn't the same sort of lockdown situations that they have now. And while the guards would chase us every day, they chased us with the idea that they'd be chasing us the next day as well. And some, you know, everybody you knew was somehow affiliated to the university. Either their dad was a professor, or somebody worked, you know, in the janitorial staff or in the library or wherever. You know, pretty much it was that and the hospital were two of the major employers in Princeton itself. And there were places like Educational Testing Services, and RCA had a place. I mean, it was a pretty vibrant little town, actually. And
do you kind of remember the change over from Pennsylvania?
Oh, heck yeah.
Like the environment as a child there and moving?
It was all farm fields when we were in Lansdale. I mean, our house was on 2.5 acres, surrounded by farm fields, and across the one was my dad's parents. So I'd walk across the field and cut the grass for them in exchange for piano lessons. It was my first barter. My grandmother would not give me lessons for free. I had to cut the grass for her. But yeah, it was so. You know, the closest other kids to us were a quarter mile away.
Wow.
You know, and it, you know, on a busy road, we moved to Princeton, and there were 8 other kids like within our block. You know, it was like row houses in Princeton. Everyone was right on top of each other. It was pretty cool, actually. We made friends pretty quickly, and it was nice.
And what about reflecting on your schooling years? How was that experience? I guess you could, if you wanted to focus more on when you were in Princeton.
Well, interestingly enough, the teachers that I had when we were in Lansdale, unbeknownst to me, it came to find this out later, had been really progressive. They were doing open classrooms, and students could sort of learn at their own pace. And apparently I was one of those that I don't know, again, if it was my upbringing with my parents, grandparents, whatever else, I was very inquisitive. So apparently in all of the subjects, I was well ahead of other classes, being self-directed. I just kept working my way through. Princeton was a much more structured school environment, but it was a similar sort of thing where you had multiple grades in different wings, and your grade would have several different teachers, and you'd rotate from teacher to teacher depending on the class. But by that time, I was always sort of fascinated. I was a big reader as a kid, and everything and anything. And then when we moved to Princeton, my dad's library was ridiculous, right?
Mm-hmm.
From Paul Tillich to, the Iliad and the Odyssey. I was that ridiculous kid that the one year after summer vacation, the American Lit teacher asked, what did everyone read over their vacation? I had read War and Peace. For which things were thrown at me, but the teacher was very impressed. I was a voracious reader, and it didn't matter what the subject was. If it grabbed my attention, I would just go through and read it. It started, oddly enough, with the Hardy Boys.
Really?
Yeah, I read all the Hardy Boy books in like one summer.
Wow.
And then just kept going.
Nice. And were you gravitating more towards English literature, or were you in high school? What were you kind of thinking that you wanted to?
Yeah, I
wasn't
doing a lot of thinking. I really, I mean, it was I was fascinated by a lot of things. I loved biology, and ended up they only had like 2 biology classes, and after the second one, the teacher set up a thing where I could audit a beginning biology class at the university, which was cool for a semester, which was pretty neat. And this is before they had some what they call advanced classes, like particularly in Latin and chemistry and whatever else. But he set this up for me to do, which was pretty cool. No, there was no particular subject. Chemistry I was horrible at, and I'm not sure why. But most of the other ones I enjoyed learning. I did not know what I was going to. I wasn't going to go to college. I was going to go to a Votech school, honestly, and was also
what was
auto mechanics. I was going to go into auto mechanics or auto or marine mechanics, because I really liked working with my hands. I was doing that. My dad, to help with the family budget, not just being in seminary, started building decks and additions and stuff. And so at the age of 13, I was helping out, and that stuff had always come sort of naturally to me, because you grow up in farm country, you know which end of the hammer to pick up, right? But yeah, so the whole college thing, I wasn't necessarily going to do. I wanted to do Votech, but I was also very big into soccer, and realized that Votech programs did not have soccer programs. So my last year in school, I applied to a bunch of colleges, and was going to sort of wing it at that point. But I figured maybe go for architecture. My dad was a civil engineer. I could go into building with him. We could have an all-in-one sort of situation with the design and build and structure and all of that. And went off to Lehigh University with, when my parents gave me $1,500, and I borrowed whatever I could from the SBA. At that point, the maximum was $7,500, and after 3 semesters, I had spent that and ended up having to drop out, unfortunately. But I had a great time playing soccer. I walked on, made the team, made varsity my second year, and I remember sitting with the soccer coach and the dean. I guess that would have been the fall semester of my second year, and the dean looking at my grades, which were because I was much more into soccer and being away from home and exploring other things. But apparently my parents, we had filled out my financial aid forms incorrectly. And he was like, you should be on a full ride here, particularly with if the coach is going to vouch for you and put you on the team, et cetera. He's like, if you can get through next semester. I was like, I have none. So, and quite honestly, I don't know that, other than for the soccer, I was not cut out for college. I was pretty much a screw up for my 3 semesters in school. It was everything else but the schoolwork.
But like you said before going, you were interested more in mechanics and carpentry. Were you like, because you had been working with your dad,
yeah.
So you were more interested in that.
Yeah.
Anyway, but the soccer was what attracted you.
Yeah. It was the continuing to play soccer. And yeah, I mean, I was one of those kids that the first time away from, not that I basically I could do what I wanted as a kid. The rule was that on the weekends when I worked for my dad, I could stay out as long as I wanted. I had to be in the truck at 5:30 in the morning when we were going to work, and he would ask no questions. And as long as my grades didn't drop below, a B or B plus average, they asked no questions. And our school, Princeton High School at that time, had an open campus whereby if your grades were of a certain level, you could come and go as you wanted. And at the point where you got your learner's permit, you could also write your own notes. So my whole senior year, I lived 2 blocks away from the school. I'd walk to school with my friends, go home and get the car, pick up my friends. We'd drive down to the Jersey Shore for the day, come back sunburnt to heck, and hand a note to my homeroom teacher the next day. Please excuse Dave from class. He was sick. And as long as my grades were fine, there was nothing he could do about it. He turned as red as I did almost every time. So high school was sort of a college experience for me, right? And then when I got to college, I more or less went off the rails, which was, not necessarily good, but in hindsight, I'm here. I lived through it.
Yeah. And what were you kind of thinking after college? Were you were interested in music as well?
I was. I played piano as a kid, and I sang in the choir all through high school, which was a fascinating experience as well. But it was more on the listening side of music. And then I had a couple of friends that were going to go to the Berklee College of Music in Boston for a summer. And I looked into it and was like, I'll give that a go. So I ended up going to the Berklee College of Music, which is a jazz school. I didn't know thing one about jazz. I'd played class. I basically sang or played classical music. What I listened to at that point in the late 60s, late 70s, early 80s was punk rock. Punk rock turned my head around to music entirely. So I could play classical music, sight reading, and I was listening to punk rock. What the heck was I going to do at a jazz school? But Boston for a summer was absolutely spectacular.
That was in the 70s.
That was in 1980. I graduated 80, so it would have been the summer of 81.
Oh, okay.
Right? So my first couple semesters were 80, 81. So that summer of 81, I went to the Berklee College of Music, and was there. It was a 5-week program? I think it was a 5-week program. Week 2, I punched a wall and broke 2 fingers on my hand, so I wasn't playing much piano either. I was also a very angry young man. And I don't know where that came from. Probably just the angst of going through the teenage years and all that. But I tended to act out a little bit, for which I'm paying penance now. So Berklee introduced me to music in a different sense, and I was playing the piano, and then I fell in love had always loved the sound of rock and roll bass guitar, and left Berklee College of Music and bought myself a bass and taught myself to play the bass. And at that point made another very big mistake in life. Never follow a girl across the country. I met a girl at the Berklee College of Music who's going to be going to Denver University the next year. Went and visited her and her family in Indianapolis. We made the plans that next Christmas I was going to pick her up and drive her out to Denver University. And they tell you never follow a girl across the country, and they're right. Denver was quite possibly the hardest 3 months of my life. I got there. I had a job. I had an apartment. I was there 3 months. No, maybe I'm sorry, more like 4 or 5 months. But the job didn't last. The girl ended up. I walked in on her sleeping with somebody else, and the apartment that I had overnight turned from a month-to-month rental to a by-the-week rental. And I hadn't paid, so all my stuff was in the super's apartment, and my car was across the street with no gas in it. So I ended up undomiciled is the polite term now for a little while in Denver. Sort of finding my way. And a friend at the university, or a guy I'd met and was playing music with his friend, was moving to LA. And he's like, "You have a car?" I'm like, "Yes." So he said, "If I pay for gas, will you drive me to California?" I was like, "Absolutely. Got nothing." And I said, "I'm going to need to borrow a couple dollars to get my stuff out of Hawk in the super's office." And he was like, "Fine." We loaded everything up and drove to Los Angeles in a 72 Catalina that I had driven across country to Denver in the first place.
Wow.
73 Catalina.
So, and at that point, you were kind of like, "Oh, this is a good thing in a way to just get out of Denver and
Yes.
go to the even further west to LA and see what
Right.
might be in store."
I knew what was in Denver. I didn't know what was in LA.
Yeah.
So in this case, the devil you don't know is more attractive than the devil you know. And there was the guy I'd been playing music with. We were going to be going to LA. We were going to do a demo. Somebody, I guess, had put up some money for that, and that very same person set the guy that I drove out there with and I up with an apartment when we got there in Beverly Hills. He set us up in the apartment. Neither one of us had a job. My friend actually got a job fairly quickly. I worked, day jobs doing construction when I could hire onto a crew. But basically, I was in that apartment 3 months, and when I moved out 3 months later, I was 3 months behind in rent. I found a band that I auditioned with and was playing with. They were out in Malibu, so you don't have to cry for me. I landed pretty well in California. I just didn't have any money or a place to live. So the band's the lead singer, we used to rehearse in his garage. His parents soon found out I was staying in the garage, and offered that as long as I got a job, they would put me up. They had an extra bedroom, so I got a job. Grudgingly, but I got a job. Played with this band for quite some time. Then things started to look up a little bit.
But how would you describe LA in the 80s? And
Wild. I mean, there was a club scene that had sort of grown out of the disco era, right? I mean, so there were clubs everywhere. What had been the sort of hardcore punk rock scene in New York in the late 70s had now migrated to Southern California. And the punk rock scene in the early 80s was really, really vibrant and was cool. And you could go just about anywhere and see some really good bands. I mean, that's when Black Flag was coming up, and the Circle Jerks and Suicidal Tendencies. And one of the gigs that we played, we opened at a club I had never heard of. It was just there, obviously, but Los Lobos was the headlining band, and I had never heard them before. I stood gobsmacked listening to them. Later found out that they go back to the 70s. I mean, they're a much older band, but man, they were part of the current scene in LA at that point. The Red Hot Chili Peppers. I mean, these guys were all just starting out, right? And it was a cool scene. It was a really cool scene.
What about like any of the British, because I know the Sex Pistols came over.
Yes, that would have been earlier. That would have been the late 70s.
Oh, okay.
So that was the era of the British and New York scene were a little bit earlier than the LA scene. So you had the Ramones were huge on the East Coast, and that was late 70s. Although they were all the way through the 80s into the 90s. They stuck around a long time. But yeah, there was a very small and flourishing Southern California scene and a Northern California scene as well. But the Southern California scene was Orange County and Los Angeles were big spots for that scene at that time. And the band that I was in was just this silly, like, surf pop band out of Malibu. But what I was listening to was entirely different than what our band was playing. But It was really cool. That was a big portion of much like that sort of early childhood part where I was reading a lot. That portion of my life, I think I still go back to. I don't remember a lot of it, I'll be honest with you, because I was pretty wildly out of control. It's a funny story. I went back several years, probably like 5 or 6 years ago. My wife and I went back, stayed in Venice Beach, hung out at the request of some of my friends that were in the band, and they wanted to get together for an afternoon play. And I was like, I don't remember any of this stuff. Some of it came back. We played for a little while, and we sat around, had a couple of beers, and they're telling all these stories, and I'm laughing, and my buddy nudges me. He goes, "You don't have any idea." I'm like, "No." He goes, "All of these stories are about you." And then the guy directly across from me said, "We are surprised you are still here." And I was stunned because, in the moment, you don't think about anything like that. I was just, wilding my way through my 20s. And, but it was sort of eye opening, but that experience, that period of time was really, somewhat character forming, even though I was likely out of control. There's a lot of growth, I think, that came out of that period. I mean, I had to fend for myself. My parents found out years and years later that I had been without in Denver and then had moved to LA, and clearly they would have helped if they could. And it didn't occur to me to reach out and say, "Hey, I'm homeless. Can you send me money?" And I don't know if it's because when I went off to college, I mean, they basically, all the money they had, I mean, likely my dad spent my college fund going to seminary, which, fair enough, right? They had never promised me anything as far as for going to college. But that was probably sitting in my head. There's like, well, they're no better off than I am, except that they had a roof over their head, but they're not, they're not in a position to bail me out, really. And
it wasn't like, after you didn't want to go back.
Right.
With that, it's like,
right.
I want to go on my own and see.
Right.
So it's like they probably would have taken you back in, but at the same time you want to explore and.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and at some point, probably the late 80s, I did move back, and for a period of time, I crashed at my parents' house for a little while I was getting on my feet again, and ended up in New York City. And
what kind of how did the decision come about to relocate back to the East Coast?
So the band situation in Malibu broke up because they threw me out of the band. Well, yeah, that was a funny situation because the guitar player and I were really close. I had written all the lyrics for the songs and half the music to the tunes. And on my way out their garage, I was like, I don't know what you guys are going to play. But so they kicked me out. And I started writing on my own and auditioned for other bands. And a person that I knew was setting up a fundraiser in San Francisco for the Pearl Buck Foundation. And he was going to do this concert and blah, blah, blah. And I wrote a song that they took as the sort of the theme song for the concert. And then I put together a band of people whom I had met through other people. And my sister at the time was dating the keyboard player from Parliament Funkadelic. So I met him. And I had a who's who list of people that were going to play in this like pickup band to play this song at this concert. Turns out the whole thing was a scam, and my buddy was scamming the Pearl Buck Foundation for money, and so that blew up, and I ended up again I was broke, nearly undomiciled in San Francisco, at which point I took the last money I had and flew back to the East Coast, because I was not gonna go back again to LA and try and start over. So I figured, let me go back to the East Coast, and we'll try the East Coast. My dad, at this point, I'd worked the entire time, right? While I was in outside of Los Angeles, I BS'd my way into a cabinet shop, because I'd always done construction. They were looking for an installer, and I figured I can install cabinets, which I did. And then within a couple of months' time, was also building cabinets for them, doing the finish work, and sort of worked my way into learning cabinetry. So when I moved back, my dad's construction firm had become quite large. Well, quite large. He had probably 10 or 12 guys working, and up to 4 or 5 jobs going at any given time. And I proposed to him that with any of those jobs that needed cabinetry, we could do them in-house. And we did for quite some time. And that worked out fairly well. I set up a shop above their garage and, lived there for a little while. When I finally moved into New York City, I did a reverse commute for a while, which was hell.
Where were you in New York City?
Initially, 2nd Street between Avenues A and B, and then Clinton between Delancey and Rivington, and this was all like late 80s. So these were not nice neighborhoods. They were cool neighborhoods, but they were still they could be sketchy.
Yeah.
And then I met my now wife, who I'd known as a kid, re-met her, and she moved into the city with me on the place on Clinton Street, which was fascinating. And then I had a 1,200 square foot apartment for $400 a month.
Wow.
Came to find out why. The building was on rent strike. The guy that I was subletting from never let me know. So I got an eviction notice under the door. And so she and I ended up getting a place on 3rd Avenue between 22nd and 23rd. And then eventually a place on 5th Street between A and B, where we spent the 15 years before we moved out to Greenport. And she had a very successful, after college, she moved into the city, worked for a couple of different companies, ended up working at a photo stock agency and representation agency for photographers, and then moved to another place, and a bunch of photographers convinced her to start her own agency, which she did, which became quite successful. Mostly she worked with up-and-coming photographers, but she had the first young black male photographer who got the cover of Time magazine.
Wow.
And she had some really good photographers and a really good reputation in an industry where reputations are not necessarily all that good all the time. But she had a very, very good reputation. And soon after she started her agency, I ended up starting a set building company with a friend of mine, and we did sets mostly for still photography, catalogs, et cetera, and figured out a method by which we could do multiple jobs in a day. So we cut the price, but we could do multiple jobs in a day, whereas it had been people would sit, right? So you'd build the set, and if it needed to be repainted, you repaint it. We went off the model that we'll come in and we'll build it for you, however complicated it is. You've got plenty of production assistants standing around that know which end of a roller to hold. Just roll a new coat of paint on, we'll leave it, and we'll come strike it at the end. And it was a really successful model. Within 3 years, we had grossed $1 million and had 15 employees. It was a really, really successful little venture. It still is going. It's an ongoing company, but not with me in it.
And could you talk a little bit more about New York City at that time, and just because you mentioned the neighborhoods and some of it was definitely
I moved back immediately after the Mets won the World Series, so that'll give you the time frame of when I moved back. I was the one jackass on the 101 freeway in Los Angeles, or outside of Los Angeles, jumping up and down on the side of the road when the Mets were going to the World Series. They had just beaten the Houston Astros, and people were like, "What is that guy doing?" So I moved back, and the East Village at that time, it was, there was a tent city in Tompkins Square Park. There was the famous squeegee men all over the place. But the East Village was a true neighborhood. I mean, it was sketchy. Funny story. Jen and I moved into Fifth Street between A and B, and she went out to get some stuff because we were going to clean the apartment. And there was a bodega at the western side of the street down at Avenue B, and there was one in the middle of the block. And she came back about 20 minutes later, and she's like, "That place doesn't have anything." And like, "You went to the one in the middle of the block, which was thick plexiglass with a little turntable serving thing. It's a drug spot. It was a drug spot." And she had no idea. She said all the boxes in the window were all faded and everything else. I'm like, "Yeah, it's not a real deli. I'll go get the stuff down at the other." So it was a substantial drug neighborhood, right? I mean, second between A and B when I first moved back there in '87. I remember reading the New York Times, and they were laying out the biggest drug areas through the city, and that was one of the biggest pickups for heroin in the city because it was close enough to the Williamsburg Bridge. It was close enough to the tunnels that you come down 2nd Street between A and B, and a week didn't go by you didn't see the blue windbreakers with DEA on the back. And, but it was the safest block I ever lived on. They didn't want any trouble. 2 blocks up was the Hells Angels block, right? 3rd Street between 1st and 2nd, also a very safe block. For different reasons, but also a very safe block.
Maybe when looking at those streets, it looked not so safe, but at the same time, you still felt comfortable walking around. And
yeah, well, they looked fairly safe. There wasn't, because on 2nd between A and B, yeah, it was a big drug dealing block, but they didn't want junkies there. They didn't want anything that drew attention, right? So it was, you'd see kids playing. I mean, part of that is sad because there would be kids walking around trying to sell works, right? They were trying to sell needles and stuff. And I don't know. I don't want to expound upon that too much because I don't know that it ends up, unfortunately, being a part of how our society works. And I don't know that there's a cut and dried way to stop abusive behavior, either self-inflicted or right. I mean, the world has struggled with drug abuse for eons, right?
And there was things were starting to change in New York, I guess, and there was the whole war on drugs at that time, and things, obviously they were trying to, I think, improve things, but then some things you can criticize in how it was taken.
Yeah. I mean, I'm one of those that does not believe that the war on drugs was a real success. I mean, I think that it certainly vilified certain segments of the population, and not, I would say, more socioeconomic than race or creed, right? I mean, I think if you were poor and you had a choice of eating or doing drugs, and the drugs made you feel better, you were probably doing the drugs, right? And that's just a sad state of affairs, but that's the state of affairs. And I think that I think the effort that the government put towards that could have been done in better ways. And I'm not saying don't police it, because I think we should be policing, right? But the heavy-handed, just sort of obliterating, just specific neighborhoods, because there was more use in the higher class neighborhoods, but the crack houses were in the poorer neighborhoods, right? So they took a much bigger hit. Meanwhile, there was plenty of crack being smoked on the Upper East Side, right? And in the suburbs, and primarily in the suburbs. I mean, most of the drug addiction problems turn out to be in the suburbs.
Yeah, a lot of people don't like to talk about that. Where it's like, oh, it's all the inner city. It's like there's tons of it in the suburbs.
Most of the stuff that was driving down Avenue B, picking up their heroin, was going back to Connecticut, New Jersey, across the river, out to Long Island, right? I mean, it wasn't staying in that neighborhood. Yes, there were people using in the neighborhood, but not at the level of the dealing that was going on, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think that's part of where I think we probably went a little heavy-handed on the enforcement portion of it, right?
Yeah.
And never really bothered to try and
Figure out
why people are using and where again, right? So if that dirty little secret had come out years and years and years ago that most of this use is in the suburbs, it might have been.
Let's try to combat where it's coming. Like who's?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
And then just a little bit, because you were living there for 15 years. Yeah,
pretty close. Yeah.
So what was that time frame? Like 80?
It was like 86 till we came out here, 2001.
2001. And over that time, you had Giuliani and a lot of the gentrification.
Yes.
Over that time, did you see the neighborhood really?
Absolutely. Yeah, and NYU bought up the East Village.
Oh, okay.
And NYU bought it up for student housing, and yeah, it changed dramatically. It went from quirky little neighborhood bars to people coming in, because in those neighborhoods, the people that come in, they hear it's a tough neighborhood or a tough bar, and they want to cut their eye teeth on that, right? They want to. So we'd be sitting, and a bunch of young kids would come in looking for a fight. I was like, nobody here wants to fight you, man. Right? We're just hanging out. So it became that, and then there was that, and then there was the gangs of NYU kids roaming around, getting just as drunk as they possibly could, which oddly enough I had been doing some 20 years earlier in my early 20s, right? So I didn't blame them, but that changed that neighborhood pretty dramatically, and raised the rents substantially. And my wife and I were lucky that we were in a rent stabilized building. It wasn't rent controlled, rent stabilized. So it was the only reason we were ever able to buy a house out here, that we could afford the rent. So you moved out in 2001.
Yeah. And was that because that was September 11th?
Yeah. Oddly enough, that wasn't the reason we moved out. We'd found a place. We had been looking, because it was one of the few times in my wife's and my life. We've been together now 35 years. We've both always been self-employed, and in general, with that, one person's earning, the other one's not, right? Or one person's doing pretty well, and the other one's not doing so well. There was a period there in the mid 90s where both her business and my set building business was doing pretty well. So we were putting some money aside, and we wanted to, starting up the business. Her parents initially had offered to loan us the money to buy a building. The idea would be that I'd have a shop in the ground floor. We'd rent out the others. And we started looking early 90s in the East Village area and Williamsburg. And we found some places, but, $1 million. And I was like, I can't owe your parents $1 million. I can't. I couldn't get my head around that sort of. Yeah. And God bless them. They were willing to co-sign, and they were willing to put that investment into the two of us, which was really kind. We couldn't accept it. Instead, what they did was they gave me the upfront money to start the set building business, and my partner's parents did the same thing. And with, what was it, like $25,000 and a dream, we started the set building company. And the idea was that Jen's parents said, whatever you're going to pay us back, or maybe it was 25 each, maybe it was 50,000 total. We started the business. They said, pay the money back, but pay it to your savings account and put that towards a house or something somewhere, or, to buy an apartment, which was really kind. So we did, and we put that money aside. And so in the late 90s, we started looking in Vermont, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and found some beautiful stuff. But for a weekend, summer house was way too far outside the city. And neither one of us were going back to Jersey. Jen was also, her family moved from central PA to eastern PA near where my parents were, and then to Princeton the same time we did. So we were not going back to Jersey. And, you know, so it was like, do we buy an apartment in the city or do we try and find something outside of? And we looked and looked and looked, and I had a friend that had moved out to Mattituck, and one weekend he needed help dropping a motor into a little Austin Healey convertible. So I drove out on a Saturday morning and helped him do that. Drove back on a Sunday morning, and was like, Jen, we should be looking out there. We'd only ever come out on a motorcycle on a Friday night with all the traffic, and gone back on a Sunday night with all the traffic, and like. But if you avoid the traffic, the east end of Long Island is pretty special.
Yes.
So we did, and I want to say within a month we had a house. We came out here only twice looking for houses. Found the place that we're in now and put in an offer, and so it was that year, September 11th happened. We were taking our first vacation in our new house. We'd had the house we'd closed on it end of August. Labor Day was early that year, and we were out for the Labor Day weekend, and we split our shop. My partner worked for that one, and I forget. I think we swapped Memorial Day and Labor Day, right? So we had half of our crew working, half of our crew was on vacation. I was on vacation, and that morning we were getting a call from the shop saying, "Turn on the TV." We had a couple of, actually 3 or 4 of the guys that had worked for us were out at the house with us. We were, drinking beers and eating clams and, having a good old time the night before. The only TV was in one of the rooms one of the guys was staying in. We barged into the room, turn on the TV, because he's saying somebody just hit the World Trade Tower. We're like, no, it's a freaking joke. After, it was an old black and white TV, because that's what we got at the op shop.
Yeah.
Turned it on as it warmed up. We watched that transpire, and our crew, we had a shop on between Delancey and Broome, Eldridge Street, between Broome and Delancey. We had a shop, and then the other shop was in Brooklyn at the end of India Street. So they were on the roof of the shop out in India Street watching all this happen. Wow. And a couple of them actually came out to us because they couldn't get back across the bridge. The ones that lived in Manhattan couldn't get back across the bridge. They took the drive out to us and stayed with us for the next day or so. And then, we went back to work at the end of our vacation. And that was a sad drive back in. Yeah. Coming down the BQE and looking at skyline was not the same. Yeah. And the smell was memorable. We weren't that close. We were 15, 20 blocks, right? I mean, we're above Delancey Street, so we weren't that close, but the city was weird at that point. There was the only other time that I recall where people were that kind to each other and that quiet were in blackouts. Blackout happens in New York City, and all of a sudden everybody's your friend. They'll help you out. They're quiet. They're not yelling.
Those are the only 2 times you remember where people actually came together more so. But and then now, just to talk about when you moved out here, what did you initially think of Greenport at the time?
I thought it was spectacular. I mean, I think the first thing I said to Jen was, it's a little city. It's got its own water, sewer, electric. Yeah. It's spectacular, right? It's in the middle of a farming area. I think I said to her, if it all goes to hell, we're fine out here because we can grow what we need. We have electric, we have water, we have sewer. Yeah. It's all good. And it was a great little village, right? And very accessible. Had a library, a hospital. I mean, all the stuff that I grew up with was here, and it was just sort of one of those, like, it just made sense, right? I mean, because a lot of people grow up in areas that don't have those things. I mean, I don't remember a time ever as a kid living in a place where there wasn't a hospital in town, right? Which is unusual. I'm one of those odd people that have always, everywhere we've lived, there's been a hospital, which a lot of people overlook. And, but the library was huge. The historical society here was huge to us when we moved here, because I'm still one of those people. I like learning stuff, and I like history, and I like delving into it. I picked up every book I could on the history of Greenport, which helped me out tremendously, honestly, because when you start talking to people here and you can actually intelligently discuss what happened and when, and there were people that had grown up here that I'd tell them something, they'd be like, no, and I'd pull out a book and show them, they'd be like, oh, wow, how did you know that? It's like, read it. Read it. Talk to somebody at the Historical Society, because Gail Horton at that point was doing, she and Antonia Booth were doing oral histories of people, and found that stuff spectacular. Those meetings were really cool, because there were a couple of them that she would do them for the meeting, and she'd have somebody come in and talk about, the fishing industry or whatever industry, and really cool stuff.
Yeah. And at that time, I think some people have said that in like 2001, the Greenport was on a rebound, as they might say. Yeah. With some of the things that were going on with Mitchell's Park and other things. Yeah,
absolutely. There had been, there'd been reinvestment. It was becoming a second home place again. I mean, Greenport had always been a resort area. I mean, there were 5 or 7 rooming houses, like major hotels and inns. This was a major stopping point up along the coast. I mean, and initially there was to be a ferry. The reason the railroad is there is there was going to be a ferry from the end of the railroad to Boston. And they built the railroad. They didn't get the charter to do the ferry. So, I mean, this was historically a very busy spot. Yeah. And it went through some downtimes when the fishing industry started to collapse, when the Menhaden stock in particular started to fade. And, at the same time, the farming was sort of monocrop at that point. I mean, it was all potatoes, and it was all, Lay's potato chips bought all the potatoes that were grown out here. So it was sort of, you had a monocrop for most of what the farmers were doing, and you had a fishing industry that was, sort of slowly disappearing because that crop was also starting to fail. So economically, there was a bit of a downturn for the whole area, but primarily Greenport, because it's a much denser little area, right? Yeah. And there was there were more second homes being bought, and there was they were trying to rejuvenate Mitchell Park. It took some older buildings, the old Mitchell property that had burned was gone. They had Kokomo, so they cleared up that area and started doing the park, moved the carousel there. The old Grumman carousel ended up there instead of the corner of 3rd and it was at the corner of 3rd and Front when we moved here, and it had spent some time down on Carpenter Street. And so that was all going on, and we were sort of, unbeknownst to us, we were sort of a part of that. I didn't realize at the time that, much like during COVID out here, there was a big influx of population leaving New York City, coming here after 9/11. We did the same thing. I mean, but it was through happenstance. It was just my business partner and I were not. I wanted to work myself out of the business and just be a part owner, and he couldn't figure that out. So at the point where we're just going to come to blows, I was like, "Buy me out. I'll go out to the East End and figure shit out, and on we'll go." Right. And Jen's business took a huge hit from 9/11. All the photographers that she had worked with could no longer get work because all of the major photographers were taking whatever work they could. So most of her photographers were not working. She ended up working for another agency for a while. And so we ended up out here full time. I think I was out here within 6 months of our taking our first vacation. Jen was a year later. But hers was more directly related to the 9/11. But we didn't even recognize what was going on because we were brand new. So we didn't know who else was also brand new necessarily. We had a large mix of people that we were acquainted with here. Some people that had grown up here, some people that were fairly new, some people that had been here for 15, 20 years at that time, right? So I didn't even recognize until somebody pointed it out to me with the COVID thing. I'm like, well, the same thing happened after 9/11. I was like, I guess, yes, it would have.
Yes.
Yes, it would have. So, and that, to an extent, helped the real estate market out here, which helped, there were new businesses coming in, and of course, rejuvenating Mitchell Park helped with that as well. And the village itself advertising as, come here and it's a family-friendly place, et cetera, et cetera. It is that now.
Yeah.
It has come all the way back.
Yeah.
It has come all the way back.
And so after moving out here, when did you establish your furniture business?
Pretty much immediately.
Pretty much.
Yeah. I basically took them. I didn't go and find another job at Jen's recommendation. She said, you have the money from the settlement. She was still employed, for a major agency. She actually was getting a pretty decent salary at that point. And so she was like, just go build half a dozen pieces of furniture, and we'll figure out a way to show your work and see if this is something you can actually do. So we did. I spent a year and a half, 2 years maybe, building a bunch of pieces of furniture. And a woman, Myra, from Gallery M, showed our work. And I think I had 6 or 7 pieces in, sold 4 of them, and one to my parents, to be fair. And so it sort of went from there. And I had always thought, okay, well, I'll do cabinetry and furniture. And Jen insisted that, no, if you're going to be a furniture maker, do furniture. Because if you do cabinetry, that's all you're going to end up doing. So that's what I stuck with for the first part. And obviously I do cabinetry now because it pays the bills. But, in the meantime, that was fun to do. It's fun to explore. That's that creative side.
And also at this time, or after you have moved here and established your business, how did you decide to run for village mayor?
Yes. Because of the way I was raised. I went to a village meeting because I was out here. My time was a little bit more fluid than Jen's was, so I stayed out here for one of the village meetings and realized how accessible it was. Because already I was fascinated by the inner workings, right? That it had all of the different facilities. And it was much more civilized than a community board meeting. I mean, community board number 2 in the East Village usually ended up in fistfights.
Wow.
Yeah, they were tough. And this was very civilized. And you got the sense that, if you asked a question, you'd get an answer, and you could do the research, and it was tangible and accessible, which I found fascinating. So I kept going to meetings, and came to the realization that the park was wonderful, but it was a $16 million project. I'm going to use round terms because I obviously don't have them in my, but roughly a $16 million park. Everyone kept saying their grants, they were matching grants, which meant the village had to come up with $8 million. At the time, the village, all in, with all of its electric, water, sewer, etc., was an $8 million a year or $9 million a year industry business. So it had as much debt as it did so in my opinion, I've never been great with, I'm good with basic finance, right? But that didn't seem right to me. And where was the money going to come from to cover the match on the grants? So I started asking those questions and didn't get really good answers, right? And my predecessor did a great job with the park. in my opinion, I said this countless times at meetings, if you just raised taxes with a cost of living, you could have defeased a good portion of that debt as you went. But he held a line in the sand that he said he wasn't going to raise taxes to do the project. And I get it that I wasn't here when he proposed that project, and it may never have gotten off the ground if he hadn't done what he did. So I'm never going to second guess what he did. I'll tell you what I was questioning, and I still wasn't getting good answers to that in my opinion. And then they started selling properties. The village had some buildings down on Lower Main Street that housed, at that point, they were public restrooms. They sold that building. They had the building the cast was in. They sold that building. They were selling things, and then they were going to sell Clark's Beach, which is a 15-acre, beautiful piece of property on the sound that the outfall pipe from the sewer plant empties onto, right? But apparently there was this deal, and that was going to settle all of the problems with the money for the grants. So in that time, and to answer your question, the reason I decided to run, because that's the way I was raised. If you're going to stand up and shoot your mouth off, you back it up with something. So I was going to run for trustee, because the thought was that my predecessor, Dave Capel, was going to run again, right? But we wanted to get a board that was not in his pocket. That was the interpretation was that he controlled the board regardless, that it was basically his board. So I was going to run for trustee. There were several other people that were going to run as well. And then somebody suggested, well, then maybe somebody should run against him for mayor. And I said, okay, I'll do that. And I'll make sure that we keep the discussion where, focus the discussion where it should be. We'll get a bunch of other people elected as trustee. I'm not going to win. I'm new here. I've been here 4 years. There's no way in hell I'm going to win this election. But so the same paper I announced I was running for mayor, he announced he wasn't going to run for mayor. And that, honestly, Chris, was the scariest couple of days, because I was going to be running unopposed, and I had no clue as to what I was about to get myself into. Right? So somebody else did step up to run, and I did a lot of research, did a lot of reading on the finances, did a lot of reading on the history of the different enterprise funds and how municipal government works, and still didn't expect to win. I was running against a guy who was born and raised here, but I was going to knock on every door. I was going to make my case, right? The only thing that has been consistent in my life, I may have had some really screwed up periods in my life, but you'll always get 100%. I will work until I can't work anymore to get something done. And Jen was behind it, and she went and knocked on the doors with me, because, as she said, she put me up in front of a mirror. At the time I had very long hair, a lot of facial hair, the piercings, the whole bit. She said, if you go and knock on some of these little old ladies' doors, you may get shot, or you're going to get the police called on you for sure. So I'll go with you. And God bless her, she did. And we had some really cool conversations. We had some very interesting ones, some very terse ones. And we were going to start, and I'm like, where do we start? We were walking up. We were going to basically do, the village boundary is 6th Street, 6th Avenue. We were at 6th Street and front. And she looked around. She goes, oh, we'll start at St. Agnes Parish. What better place to start? So we went and talked to the priest about running for mayor. And we did. Over the course of a month or so, we knocked on, I believe, every door in the village, and I handed out a flyer to them. This is who I am. This is what I'm going to do. I was astounded at how many people actually knew the name, because I guess they read the local paper, and I'd been shooting my mouth off. So they knew the name, and the overriding comment was like, oh, you're Dave Nyce. And I'd be like, yes. I'm like, okay. Some of them were like, you need a haircut. And others were like, cool, okay.
Yeah.
The funniest one, and I just saw her the other day, the funniest one, woman opened the door and told her what I was doing. She goes, who are your people? And I was like, Mennonites. And she's like, what? Who are your people? And I'm like, oh, you mean like family here? She's like, yes. I was like, I don't have any. I don't have any people here. It's just me and my wife.
Yeah.
And she's like, okay, fair enough. Who do you know? And I started listing off people that I knew. She goes, okay, I can live with that. I saw her recently and I said, do you remember saying? She's like, yes, I do. And I remember your answer was odd and then got better.
Yeah. No, that seems like, well, it seemed like it was mostly positive from people that you...
It was.
Even though some people probably wanted to know how long you've been here and...
Yeah. I was fairly open about, my history, where I came from. I made no bones about the fact that we had moved out here from New York City and we'd only been here 4 years, right? Made no bones about it. But all that spending time with the Historical Society, reading those books, I could talk fairly intelligently with people that had been born and raised here about the history of the area and where things were, where things had been. And that was impressive to them, I guess. And it was, it must have seemed clear that I did not have any ulterior motives. I'm sure there was some trepidation about that because I was brand new, right? And nobody really knew me. And there were those things going around. It looks like he just stepped off a bunker boat and, whatever. Is this really who we're going to elect for mayor? I'm like, vote for whoever you want. I truly did not expect to win. I really didn't. And I knew, I hoped it would be close, right? I hoped that the message that I was putting out was getting across, and that people didn't think it was just some sort of like whim, that I had done my research and would give a full effort on it. And yeah, I mean, it was close. It was a close election. I mean, the headline in the Suffolk Times said exactly, I didn't expect to win. Julie Lane came over and said, you were just elected mayor. What do you think? And I said, holy shit. No idea. No idea. And people here were very welcoming to Jen and I, and very, but at the same time, very honest, which I've always appreciated. Right? I mean, if you have something that you want to say, whether it's, as long as it's not just blatantly unkind, right? For unkind's sake, I'll listen to anything. I mean, I grew up a little punk rock kid, man. People threw stuff at me. I mean, I walked on job sites and stuff would fly from everywhere. I was a kid walking on a job site with bright green hair and nails would be flying and be like, whatever. It's sort of just, after a while it rolls off your back. There are times when it gets personal and there were some hurtful things said, but you get past it.
Yeah.
It was a fascinating experience. I truly think that everybody should be involved in their community at that meaningful level, whether it's volunteer for the fire department, whether it's volunteer for CAST, whether it's be part of the municipal government, part of the library board, part of the hospital board. At the point where you participate at that level, the dialogue is much more intelligent, much more kind, much more courteous, and much more effective, right? Because everybody's at that same spot.
Yeah.
Right? They've all got, they're all sticking their necks out a little bit, right?
They're all trying to help the community in town. So you're trying to work together in that environment, whether you might disagree on some things.
Yeah.
And it should be a discussion that you can have without, like, I guess you might hear stuff outside of those meetings in other areas that just might not be helpful, and people that they'll say stuff out there, but they won't go to those meetings sometimes too.
Yes. It's another thing that I remember my grandmother and my parents saying, that if you have something to say about somebody and you can't say it to them, you should probably reconsider what you're saying, because you should be able to say whatever it is you have to say to that person.
Yeah.
Right? And that's sort of more and more lost in our modern society.
Especially with social media.
Absolutely.
I stay away from that because people they don't even think like they're talking to another face on the other side of the screen.
Absolutely.
Just let me say whatever. I don't care. But in terms of after being elected, what were some things you wanted to focus on?
Defeasing the debt for the park was primary. And then, while all of the park was being built, most of the utilities were being left unattended or just minimally. So we rebuilt the sewer plant entirely, got a rate increase to fix up the distribution system for the electric, and just went to work, built the public restrooms, and just sort of chipping away at stuff with whatever we could do that needed doing. But primarily was to turn the debt around, which we did over my 2 terms. We defeased the debt and got an increase in our bond rating, which was astounding. It was amazing to me in those years, the things that made me really, really happy. I never thought I'd be sitting here telling you that, I was on the phone with Moody's and they gave us a bond rating increase and I did a happy dance through Village Hall. And people were like, what? I'm like, we got a bond rating increase. They're like, what?
Like, okay.
That's huge. Look at where we were, and this is, this is huge. So, but it goes back to all of that same stuff. I love learning, and there was an immense amount to learn about municipal government and how it works, and that it is a continuum. I mean, whatever I focused on, the next person's not going to, right? Everything needs constant attention, right? So it really then becomes we're all working to make this a better place, to your point from before. And that it's not, at least at local government, it can still be that.
Yes.
As
I've talked with a lot of people about that, they're like, oh, well, the state and federal is kind of a disaster right now, but in terms of town and village level, there can still be people coming together and working for the good of the community. But now, because you had 2 terms as mayor, kind of looking back on that now and thinking what you've done as the mayor, I guess, what's your most kind of proudest achievement, and what did you kind of hope people would look back on at that time?
It's an interesting question. Honestly, I've never considered it. Really. I mean, I'm not big on the whole legacy thing. Because I sort of feel like at that point, then you're dead, right? You're not striving for whatever's next. But also, I don't. Again, it may be just innate in my upbringing. As a Mennonite kid, you don't say, "Hey, look at me, look at me, look at me." It's what have we done, right? Your community's only as good as the, weakest member in the community, right? So if everyone's not good, we're not good. And so I don't know. I'm proud of all of the stuff that we got done in those years. There are things that I wish we had more time to do and more money to do. But I don't know. It's like just keep moving forward. you know. Now I volunteer in the fire department. Thankfully, Jen would not. I had my application in before I ran for mayor, and she was like, "No, you're not doing both." So as soon as I was done, I joined the fire department, and that's its own fun stuff. There's a lot to learn there, and
then when did you join? Right? Did you join right after?
I joined 2014. One of my last meetings, I okayed me to join the fire department.
You're like, okay, I'm going now.
Yeah, and went in and joined. They made me a warden immediately because they're like, you understand how the village works, so you can be our warden. The warden's the fire council for the fire department. So they're sort of the like the Congress, if you will, like they're the legislative body for the fire department. It's all good. Went to fire school, learned all that stuff, then went to take the EMT course, and on we go.
And looking for, in terms of your time starting in the fire department now, are there, a lot of people have mentioned about making sure we keep a volunteer-based fire department. Has that been more of a challenge recently, or have you still seen people come in and join, or
they come in and join? Where the biggest stress right now on all the departments out here is on the medical side, on the rescue side. There aren't enough EMTs to cover the number of calls. We'll do, the last 3 years we've done nearly 1,000 calls a year, 70% of which are rescue calls, right? And that's a lot of calls. That's a lot of calls. And we have maybe 20 EMTs, and not all of them are active all the time, right? So a lot of the departments are going to a partially paid EMT staff. Stony Brook University has paramedics out here 24/7, which helps. But they're paid. Stony Brook discounts it deeply, but each district pays a bit for that. So that's where most of the stress is now. Eventually, it will likely go to a fully paid or partially paid rescue, just because of the number of calls and the fact that it's all driven by insurance and liability, right? So it's not going to get easier. So one of our big push, one of the big things we're pushing now and over the next couple of years is to recruit and retain particularly EMTs. But it's a 6-month educational program to become an EMT. It's not just like, oh, I'll sign up. The Firefighter 1 is a 14-week program, right? It's a big investment in time and effort. Rightly so, but it's a lot to ask for someone to then, volunteer their time, take out of their work day, and you're not getting paid for it, but here you go, right? But it really is an integral part of a small community, right? I mean, you see everybody, and you see them at their best and at their worst, right? But it's a cool organization, and there's a lot of history, and certainly in the fire side of it. I mean, some people attribute it to Ben Franklin and a bucket brigade in Philadelphia very early on, and soon after that they had local volunteer fire departments. But it's necessary. Thankfully, there are not nearly as many fires as there had been, but the ones that we have tend to be more deadly just because of the contents, all the plastics and everything else.
There's more. There might not be as many, but there's more dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. And you got less time to fight them because the amount of time it takes for something to become completely engulfed and reach a temperature at which you're not fighting interior, is going up exponentially. But
even with, you said the EMT calls have gone up, or has that been more?
Yeah, well, out here, I mean, you have a retirement community in Peconic Landing, right? This has become sort of a retirement area. I mean, not necessarily that it's been actively doing that, but there are also people aging at home, right? Because they can't afford to go elsewhere, so they'll bring in home health care or their kids, right? So there's a lot more of that. We're in age. We're not getting younger on the East End, right? We're not Boston. Boston's a very young city. This is not a very young area.
No, we're not. And and it's harder to keep the younger population here too.
Absolutely. 'Cause it's expensive to live out here.
So we'll have more of those needs for the older population. But
absolutely.
But like you said, with the fire department, it would be a shame to have that go into a corporate type company based system. But in terms of attracting, you might get more retired people joining, but in terms of getting younger people and how to get them, while they have to still survive with their job, but then they have to be able to volunteer for this. But we want to try to recruit.
It's tough. It's a little easier on the fire side than on the rescue side, but it's, we've had a good couple of years. I mean, we've recruited, I want to say 24 people that remain active over the last couple of years, which is good. And so it's more, we need to be doing that all the time, and then it's the retaining them is also, because there's a burnout factor, and it's not like there's a retirement benefit. There's a length of service award program that the state allows for. So you get, at 65 years old, you'll get some money monthly from the department, from an insurance and investment program that they have. But that's not necessarily helping out the younger ones, right? So we have to try and figure out a way to be a little bit more creative with the retention of younger people as well. As well as recruiting. I mean, the recruiting is fine. Most people, there are a lot of people that would like to join, and then they either get through it and realize it's way more than they bargained for, or they get partway through it and realize just the course itself is way more than they bargained for, right? So if they get all the way through it and they start responding and they're active, how do you keep them incentivized to do that?
Yeah,
it's not unique to the Greenport Fire Department. No. Every department out here is trying to figure this out. So it's I hope we find an answer.
And also, just in terms of Greenport today, what do you think, or maybe if you could think of the top 3 issues that Greenport is facing and that you feel are important to you from your perspective?
Well, that would be top of the list, is that in some way, if you're going to attract and retain a diverse socioeconomic group, you're going to have a diverse set of places for them to live, right? I mean, Jen and I bought our house. We were like, okay, our limit was $200,000, and we couldn't go above that. Thankfully, we got in a little under that. But you can't look at a house out here for you can't look at a house for under $1 million now. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy, and no one just starting out is going to be able to come up with the means to do that, right? I mean, so I don't know, and I don't know if it's got to be subsidies, or because I don't like those either necessarily. But you look at how student debt is structured, and the companies that loan that money, holy crap, are they making out? Right?
Yeah.
We're just trying to educate our kids.
Yeah.
Right?
I'm still, as an example, I'm still paying back student debt, so it's a lot of people are facing that.
So, I mean, I honestly don't know, because once you start into these conversations, I'll end up getting branded a socialist or whatever else. But there's a certain amount of no that we have to say to a capitalistic society if you want to retain a diverse socioeconomic group, right? I mean, not everybody has the same means, and we shouldn't all be competing for the same thing if we don't all have the same means. If that makes any sense. And so we have a market out here it's here. You're not getting into the market anywhere down here.
No.
So that seems a non-starter to me. How do you even approach that? So that's one. The other thing to me has always been that the ability to work out here needs to remain. You need small businesses. You need vibrant small businesses, and you need people that are paying a living wage for the area, right? And I think in general, most small communities, they do, right? I mean, farm workers do not get paid well, but they're paid better here than in a lot of places. Most of the labor prices that I'm aware of seem to be somewhat within, like a small mom and pop shop. They need that person to stay in their apartment. They need to pay them enough for them to stay in that apartment. And I think that tends to work. It's that next step. And the fact that apartments here cost, almost 90% of what they cost in the city, which is absolutely insane.
Yeah.
The rentals are insane. And that's, so do you do a rent stabilization or a rent, rent control situation? And these are the conversations where if I'm in a room with a bunch of municipal people or people that own property, it goes silent immediately.
Yeah.
And they're like, you can't tell me I can't make X amount of dollars. I'm like, when did it become expected that you get a 10% return on every investment? Right? Jen's dad ran a manufacturing facility for a blade that distributes the ink on a printing press. And I remember talking to him when I started the set building business, and he gave me the basics on business. And even at that point, this is back in the 90s, and he was like, if everything's paid and you're doing a 3 to 4% return, you're doing well, which always seemed reasonable to me, right? And then he said, and with that, take half of that and invest it back into the business. Right? There will come a time when you're going to need to take more out to, down the road, but reinvest back in your business. That's not the model anyone is doing with rental properties out here, right? They're taking all that money and spending it. So I don't think we're asking the right questions of the right people. Right?
And even, I think it always, within the system, it's always going to adjust. So even if you do raise the minimum wage,
yes,
and even small business owners will have to raise their prices, and then the property and all the people who might lease the building from, so it's almost a never-ending cycle of how do you limit that from constantly. Because people in power are always going to raise their thing to make sure they're continuing to make their profit, whereas, sure, we'll raise the minimum wage, but then we're going to. So it's almost like it's a flaw within the system.
Because we want the end result to be, and then we make everything else fit. I'm still convinced. They keep talking about inflation's not going down. Of course it's not. We raised minimum wage. You're not going to bring inflation down to the number that it used to be because we've changed everything else. And I'm no economist, right?
I don't know.
We're not economists, but you're absolutely right. You can't say we're going to change all of this, but then this all has to stay the same because at some point we have to change the way we're thinking about it. And
some people don't.
So some people are just going to have to not get as much as they want.
Yeah.
Right? My grandmother always said, take what you need and leave the rest for someone else. You don't harm yourself. If you can help someone else out, do that. But take what you need and leave the rest. And at a certain point, I don't, how much is enough for some people? And that's for them to decide.
And in terms of now being on the North Fork since 2001, what have you enjoyed the most about working and living out here?
All of it, man. It's gorgeous. Be driving to pick up materials and, go by Town Beach. It's gorgeous. We live in an absolutely stunning place. The people are wonderful. It can be a little tiny town now and again, but it's just everything about it. It has a great feel to it. It's still one of those places when we go away and we come back, we're still like, it's a nice place to be. It is special. It's very special. And also, just looking towards the future, we might have addressed some of the issues, but what do you hope for the future of Greenport and its community down the line? We figure it out. I don't mean that to sound flippant, but in the early mid-1800s, they were thinking outside the box, man. Edison invented the light bulb. They had a light plant out here, right? They had public sewer systems. It's that sort of, and that's what made this place affordable to people then. You could have these sorts of businesses. You could have this sort of density in a place and not destroy it. It's that sort of stuff that, I think we have some very, very bright people out here and people that care. And I hope we figure it out and figure out how to adapt and maintain, right? Because you're not going to, if you don't adapt, it dies, right? You can't stagnate. You can't close the door and say, this is going to be a little gated community. We're just going to keep it like it is. Those are not good societies, right? Yeah. The societies that are good are constantly adapting and figuring out what's next and how to get to what's next, and looking out for their people and their area.
Absolutely. And then, is there anything else you'd like to say or discuss that we haven't touched on?
I disavow everything I've just said. I don't know who the heck you've been talking to, but no, this has been fun. This has been fun. I hope I didn't say anything that will put people off, but that's what I think.
Yeah, it's like everyone.
And that and $2.50 will get you a cup of coffee.
Yeah. No, so I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come in today and telling your story and talking about your time in Greenport, and just kind of showing, I can tell that you have a love for the community as well as currently in the fire department. So it was really nice to talk with you.
I appreciate it very much. It was a joy talking to you as well.
Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 47 with David Nyce. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.